All right, and then let's jump to the second slide here. All right, just a few meeting norms to get us started. We please ask that everyone commit to learning and avoid speculation. So we encourage that you ask questions so we can explore the issues together. Please remember the importance of rights and the dignity of others. With that, we ask that you critique ideas and not people, and that you're thoughtful about your language so this can be a comfortable and respectful forum for all participants. And just a reminder that any sort of inappropriate written and/or verbal comment or language, including personal attacks and accusations, will result in the attendee being removed from today's meeting. Next slide, please. Okay, quick technology refresher here, just to remind all of our participants how to use the interactive features of Zoom. From a computer, we ask that if you're interested in asking a question or making a comment, that you use the raise your hand feature. So you can do that by clicking the reactions button, which should be on the bottom of your screen on the toolkit there, on the toolbar there, and go ahead and click the little raise your hand button. If you're calling in from a phone, you can also raise your hand by selecting *9, and we will identify you by the last 3 digits of your phone number. Okay, so quick demographics poll. This is not a requirement, but it does help us gain a better understanding of sort of who we're connecting with and perhaps who we're not, and how we can improve our outreach strategy. So if you don't mind, in a few minutes here, there'll be a prompt survey that comes up on your screen. You just take a few minutes to complete that. That would be very helpful for us. So I'll give everyone just a few minutes here to complete that. All right, we'll give it about 30 seconds or so, just for any of you that are finishing up on those questions. All right, perfect. Thank you so much for participating in that. Next slide, please, Carolyn. All right, we're gonna just take a few minutes here to have a little bit of a safety moment and remind everyone on the call about the importance of having a family preparedness plan and building an emergency preparedness kit. So what you see on the screen here is a little emergency checklist of some materials that you should think about having within your kit. So things like food and water, PPE, extra batteries, etc. The other thing I really want to point out here is the information there on the bottom right, which talks about how to sign up for our A2 emergency alert system. So you can do that by visiting washtenaw.org/alerts. You can register to receive various types of alerts, from weather alerts to traffic alerts to significant emergency alerts, right? So this is the system that we would use if there's some sort of emergency that will impact our community, our residents. We'll issue a message via text, email, or phone call to notify you. So highly encourage those that may be on the call today that are not registered, for those that you please take a few moments to sign up for those. Next slide, please. Okay, and then we'll just we'll go ahead and go through who's on the call today from a presenter and facilitator side of things. So just to kind of recap, from the City of Ann Arbor, I'm Sydney Parmenter, the Emergency Management Coordinator, and I've been the city project manager on the Hazard Mitigation Plan update. Jerry, if you're on, do you mind introducing yourself?
Hello, I'm Jerry Hancock. I'm the Stormwater and Floodplain Coordinator in the Systems Planning Unit at the City.
All right, and from the Stantec side, this is Carolyn Cunningham speaking. I'm the project manager. Got a few joining me today, including Christina Hurley, who will do the risk assessment, Kristen Hughes, who will do the mitigation strategy section, John Butcher, who is our planning and outreach lead, so he'll cover that information, and Matt Moy, who's helped us with GIS. Thanks, everybody. So we can now get into the meeting topic. We'll start with an agenda. So we've gotten through our introductions, and we just want to level set with the group in terms of what is this topic, what does hazard mitigation mean? And then we'll talk about why are we bothering to update this plan? Why is that important for the community? We'll review the planning process, so you have some context as we go into some of the results that we found in terms of the outreach we've conducted, the risk assessment, and the mitigation strategy. There are a few points where we're looking for your input on here, including the risk assessment, as well as the mitigation strategy and any sort of actions we might take to reduce risk. So be on the lookout for that. In addition, please feel free to use the chat if you have questions or need clarifications. We're a relatively small group, so I don't mind if you need to come off mute to answer a question as well. So let's just start with what is hazard mitigation. If this is a new topic for you, hazard mitigation is any sustained action taken to reduce or eliminate the long-term risk to human life and property from hazards. So it's really what can we do to reduce the impacts of events, disaster events, or hazard events that impact our community. And from that, we have hazard mitigation plans, and that's the topic of our conversation today. And those are really intended to help a community understand what hazard risk it has. There's a focus on natural hazards, but it does include some man-made or technological hazards in it as well. And then within those plans, we also, once we understand the risk, we work to develop strategies or actions to reduce that risk. And the intent there is really to break that disaster cycle and help our community be more resilient. So in terms of why we're updating the plan, the community needs to have, Ann Arbor needs to have a plan in place, meaning it needs to be completed and approved by FEMA and even adopted by the city in order to meet the requirements for hazard mitigation funding that comes from FEMA. That can be really substantial funding, and it is funding that the city has tapped into before. In fact, there's funding for the Allen Creek Railroad berm that used several sources, including FEMA. And there's a number of other benefits to the plan, such as CRS, and that stands for the Community Rating System. You see it there. But that's a great program that's voluntary, but the city participates in it in order to allow residents to receive a discount on their flood insurance premiums. Excuse me. There's also a number of benefits in terms of us integrating with other plans and efforts. If you're familiar with some of the other efforts going on, like the A to Zero plan, we've had representatives from that plan as part of our planning process and have made sure that we're aligning our content and strategies with that as well. And certainly as we update the plan, which gets updated every 5 years, we're always looking to iteratively improve it. There's some focus on this update in terms of climate change impacts, making that a little bit more robust and pronounced throughout the plan, as well as integrating equity. And we've done that through more robust engagement and an engagement working group that we've stood up. We're also working to have a much more actionable plan. These plans are meant to be visionary, so they have a longer lead time, but there's strategies we can also put in place to make sure that we're seeing those successes in the near term as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the planning process when we're developing a hazard mitigation plan. These are kind of 4 big buckets that we tend to think of. This comes from FEMA guidance, where we talk about organizing resources, which just means we're pulling together the planning team, we're collecting data, we're thinking about how to engage the public, and that kind of happens throughout this entire planning process. And once we kind of have that groundwork set, we can go into assessing our risk. And this is a big part of it, as I mentioned, that understanding risk to both natural and technological hazards is a big component of this plan. And that includes, of course, future hazards or climate change impacts that are included. With that information, as well as a number of other sources that we'll talk about, things like what are the city's capabilities to advance hazard mitigation or risk reduction, and what are those hot spots in terms of risk, we can then begin to develop the mitigation action plan. So developing that plan, the actions are kind of the heart of it, the heart of the mitigation plan in terms of what actions will we take near term and long term to reduce our risk. And then once we've got that plan developed, we are able to then adopt it and then move to implement it. And as mentioned, the public does stay involved throughout the process, and we'll talk about some of those throughout the presentation. So this first topic is on public engagement, and John's going to give you a little bit of an update of some of the activities that we've done for this portion of it.
All right, so hopefully you all have seen a lot of the activities that we've conducted so far to engage the public in this plan. Obviously, you've seen at least one item because you're here tonight, so thank you very much for that. We did have a kickoff meeting a few months ago. We also have our Social Pinpoint website, which you can access from the City of Ann Arbor site. But we encourage you to go there and take a look at the information there, but also we have a way for you to give us your ideas, and we will have a way for you to give feedback on the material that we cover tonight. We also put out a survey early on, and hopefully all of you took that, and I'm going to go over a few highlights of the survey results in just a minute. Meeting number 2 is tonight, and later on we're going to ask you for some input on some of the mitigation actions. And then coming up in another few weeks, we will have an opportunity for you all to review the plan and provide feedback to the city on the entire plan. And then you may have seen some tables at some events around the city. You might have seen Jerry and Sydney and some others at the Public Safety Open House, at the Green Fair, the Earth Fair celebration, Farmers Market, and the 820 Week. So hopefully you saw them there. Those were some other places where we were sharing information about the planning process. So yeah, we can go to the next one. So we had a lot of people fill out the survey this time. Last time we did this plan, we only had 113 respondents, but this time we jumped all the way up to 301. So hopefully that included all of you, and thank you very much if you did complete that survey. Some of the highlights from that are really the hazards that folks are most concerned about. So not surprisingly, given your recent history, power outages, public health emergencies, and drinking water contamination come up really high because those are things that are relevant and real and have recent impacts to you. Looking at climate threats that you all are most concerned about, not surprisingly, more extreme and frequent rainfall events and increased heat wave intensity rose to the top as well. Go to the next one, please. So then we had 197 people who filled out the survey give us some ideas for what 2 actions that they thought were the most important for the city to take. And so went through all of those and kind of grouped them into categories. And these are the categories that came out of those actions. And so when we talk about protection infrastructure improvements, those for the most part had to deal with flooding, stormwater flooding, riverine flooding, as well as the dams that you have in the city. Power grid obviously came up a lot because of your recent power outages, but that was a combination of not only making the system more resilient, hardening it, but also greening it. So looking at having a local utility that uses renewables, as well as using that as a way to provide backup power. And of course, as always, people felt like we need to share more information to educate folks and to give them ideas on things that they can do. So again, those are just some of the highlights, but that was great feedback, and hopefully you all contributed to that as well.
Great, thank you, John. And now we'll move on to the risk assessment, which Christina will cover.
Hey everyone, thanks Caroline. So as Caroline said, I'm going to share some results from the risk assessment with you all today. Just to give you a little background on how the risk assessment fits into the overall plan. So we create a hazard profile for each identified hazard, and that profile includes things like a description, location of the hazard, the probability of it occurring, its severity or like its intensity, and then as well as like potential impacts and consequences. And for this plan update, we identified 13 natural and 10 either technological or human caused hazards. And then today I'm just going to go over a few key findings. So I won't address every hazard that we went over. So if there's a question regarding a specific hazard that you might have, feel free to come off mute or drop that question in the chat and we can get it addressed for you. And then just a reminder that you will have the chance to review the entire risk assessment and all of the results in its entirety during the plan review period. All right, so touching on a few of these key findings, I think one of the first and foremost one that I wanted to touch on is increasing temperatures and heat waves. So again, we know that Ann Arbor is getting a lot warmer, and just some of the highlights to maybe point out are that there's the potential for up to 60 additional days over 90 degrees by the end of century. So currently that's about 22 days per year, and that'll be up to about 80 days per year by end of century. And just gonna put that in perspective, that's up to about 22% of the entire year being made up of days over 90 degrees. So that's pretty significant. There's also a projected change in the number of heat waves that Ann Arbor experiences. So we define heat waves as 3 or more consecutive days with temperatures above 86 degrees. And that change is from about 3 heat waves per year now to about 8 heat waves annually by end of century. So again, a pretty big jump with the potential to have some pretty substantial impacts for the community. And that's something that the National Climate Assessment, which is put forth every few years for the country as a whole, but they kind of focus on regions. They've identified the Midwest as being particularly vulnerable to extreme heat relative to other regions. And not just because of the increases that I just shared, but also just because of as preparedness and having to deal with extreme temperatures in the past. So you think of regions like the Southeast, they might be a little bit better equipped, maybe have more AC and more measures in place to deal with it, where the Midwest may not have that. So they do single out the Midwest as having the largest increase in temperature-related premature deaths. So that, again, it's something to think about when we think about what type of adaptation measures you might want to think about in the future. There's also kind of hand in hand with those increasing temperatures is the potential or projected increase in storm activity. So there are models that show that Ann Arbor will experience both an increase in severe thunderstorms, and then along with that, just a longer thunderstorm season. So you think we've got those higher heat days, kind of those summer temperatures that are beginning earlier, extending later. And then along with that, we've got those that thunderstorm activity. And then to go along with that, we see that Tornado Alley is shifting east. So, and that's been observed rather than projected. So it is kind of thought to continue over time and into the future. But over the last 40 years, it's been observed that more tornadoes are happening in the Southeast and the Midwest than there used to be. And there's actually a lower frequency occurring in Texas and the Great Plains, which is typically identified as what's called Tornado Alley. And you can see that on the map here. So anything in blue is where they're experiencing a decrease in tornado frequency. Then anything in this like red, orange, and yellow is experiencing an increase. And you can see Michigan and Ann Arbor as well as included in that. So then the next kind of key finding I wanted to touch on is increased vulnerability to power outages. So I think John mentioned, that was a pretty big concern during in the survey results. You all also experienced a pretty significant power outage event last August. So again, it's something I'm sure is already on your mind, but there are also sort of other factors in play in the future that might kind of continue to increase that vulnerability. So again, what I just spoke to, that increased storm activity, you actually think of like physical threats to the system, right? Like downed lines, downed poles, trees impacting the power lines. And then there's also just the potential threat from increased demand. So we think about like electrification to the system, which is a great strategy to help reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, but also puts additional strain on the grid, right? So we think about those shifts from things like natural gas to electricity, and then also shifts from like fuel and gasoline to electric vehicles. That just puts, again, an increased strain on the grid if the demand or if the supply is not there to meet it. And this graph that's shown here, I won't go too deep into it. It is pulled from the A to Zero plan. If you are interested, I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't already. But it just sort of exemplifies some of those like increased demands that the city will see on electricity in the future from things like EV and then what they call like a fuel switch to those sort of less clean fuel sources to electricity. And then in addition to that, there's also just increased, if you could go back one, just the demand for cooling as those temperatures increase, as well as demand from just population and economic growth. So I also wanted to talk about just increased vulnerability to the city's tree canopy. So again, I know that's a big part of sort of the Ann Arbor identity. It also provides some relief from the urban heat island effect within the city and helps the city kind of stay a little healthier, provides those recreational opportunities. But with things like warmer winters and then just warmer temperatures in general, you have both the potential for pests to survive the winter. So we think about those like native pests that are already there. And then also the potential for new pests to enter to the area as temperatures increase and species that otherwise wouldn't thrive there can now thrive. And then you also might have heat stress on the trees themselves. When you think about these trees that are heat stressed and then maybe not quite accustomed to the new temperatures that they're experiencing, combined with those pests, you could have weaker trees that either die or can be knocked down more easily during storm activity. So you think about those kind of, again, those combined factors just weakening the resilience of the tree canopy itself. And then the next key finding that I wanted to discuss is more of a, not so much a change or an addition to this plan iteration. So in the last plan in 2017, we did address water contamination to a certain extent, but we've actually included it as its own separate hazard within this plan this time around. And there's a few specific sources that we kind of looked at and addressed throughout that hazard profile. So one being water main breaks. So I know that you guys had a pretty significant water main break in June of 2021 that resulted in a 2-day boil water advisory. So this happens when bacteria can enter into the water system through that break. And that's what this picture here shows, is where you can see the collapse in a few parts of the street from the main break. Another potential source of water contamination are sewage overflows. So an example would be in July of last year, you all had a 25,000 gallon sewage overflow during an extreme rainfall event. And fortunately, during this event, none of that sewage entered into waterways, but it shows that there could be potential in the future if there's an overflow near a waterway for that contamination to occur. And we also see this as extreme rainfall events are projected to increase in both frequency and severity in the future, which we'll touch a bit on the next slide. But the last sort of potential water pollution, contamination theme we looked at is just general kind of water pollution from things like the dioxin plume, and then also just hazardous materials releases. And then the last sort of hazard I wanted to touch on a little bit today would be flood risk. So that's probably one of the more significant natural hazards that the city faces. So we looked at a few different types of flood risk. So one is riverine flooding, and that occurs when the banks themselves actually rise out, the waters rise out of the riverbanks and then flood the surrounding area. And to look at risk from that, we mapped both floodplain data from FEMA. So you think about like the National Flood Insurance Program, they map the 100-year floodplain. And then Ann Arbor also has a local model that also maps the 100-year floodplain. So we use both of those because they're significant and similar in a few ways, but they do differ a little bit. And you can kind of see it on this map, but we do have another map we can jump into and zoom in more detail, and we'll pull that up in a second here. But just to go over just some kind of basic risk results would be, so we overlaid these flooding layers with structures and then with identified critical facilities. We found that there are about 750 structures in these 100-year floodplain areas, and then as well as 8 identified critical facilities. So some of those include the dams, which are to be expected since they're on the water. Then also a few facilities like the Kellogg Ice Center, the ice arena, a middle school, and then a few Ann Arbor Housing Commission properties. And then in addition to that riverine risk, we also have what we call like pluvial risk or urban flooding. And that's generally caused by things like extreme rainfall when the drainage system can't keep up with that rainfall and can't convey it off of properties fast enough. So again, when that stormwater system gets overwhelmed, there's the potential for things like sanitary sewer system overflows or sewer backups. And then also things like roadway flooding and basement flooding. And I think a good example that shows the risk the city faces from these types of events are the June 2021 flood event that you all had, where it was a 24-hour, 100-year storm. I think you guys got about 5 inches of rainfall, and that did exceed the design standards of the city's stormwater system, so caused flooding throughout the city. And you guys actually had a federally declared disaster from that. And that's just something that exemplifies what the city could experience more and more into the future as both the intensity and the frequency of extreme rainfalls are expected to increase. So for example, like right now, a 1-day average maximum rainfall event in Ann Arbor might be about 1.6 inches, and that's projected to increase to about 1.9 inches by the 2080s, which might not seem like a huge increase, but relative to, if you think about, we're already having these events where the storm system gets overwhelmed. We think about like increasing that intensity in the future, just will have a larger impact. And then also just the frequency of the rainfall events. So looking at a rainfall event where about 1.25 inch falls, so that's, I think, defined as a 50-year storm for the area. That such storm is projected to increase from about 2 days a year currently, and that's predicted to double by the 2080s to about 4 days per year. So again, a pretty significant increase in the future and just the number of these events. And then before I go in and maybe open up the map and we can take a look at some areas if anyone's interested in sort of looking at flood risk in specific areas of the city. Any questions about these hazards or any others? Okay, well, I think we're doing okay on time. I think We can pull up the map here. And Matt, I don't know if you're able to share your screen. We can pull it up. And if anyone, I don't know if anyone's interested, maybe dropping into the chat. And if there's any parts of the city they want to see, we can zoom in and look at the risk.
Are you able to see my screen, everyone?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
And just to kind of orient you all really quickly here. So we've got our flood areas in blue, yellow, and orange. So this darker blue is what's called the FEMA floodway. I mean, that's really where like you've got kind of flowing water. And then we've got our floodplain in this lighter blue, the FEMA 100-year floodplain. And then our local flood model is in this yellow. And then the cross-hatching shows the FEMA 500-year floodplain. So you can see, I mean, it kind of makes sense with the Huron River. And then we've got our stream reaches that kind of connect the city. You can see where most of our hazards are, our buildings at risk and what we call our critical facilities at risk are kind of in this Allen Creek area. So you can see in red, we've got our structures at risk.
Jerry, I saw you come on camera. Did you have any comments you wanted to relay?
No, just available to answer questions.
I should point out in purple here, we've got our identified critical facilities. But if no one has any questions, I'll turn it back over so we can go over the mitigation strategy. But if nothing comes up now and you think of a question later, feel free to get in touch with me or send your questions to Jerry and he can either answer them or pass them my way.
And we should have some time at the end of the meeting as well. If something comes up, we'll be here. Thank you. Okay, so let me reshare here and we're going to move on to the mitigation strategy. Kristen will be presenting that.
Thank you, Caroline. My name is Kristen Hughes, and I will be providing an overview of the mitigation strategy. So the mitigation strategy has two main components: the goals, which are the guiding principles or broad statements that are consistent with the mitigation actions in the plan. And then the action plan is the other component, which includes the mitigation actions, which are the activities that have been identified to reduce risks from the identified hazards. So to date, we've reviewed and updated the goals, and we will go over those on the next slide. And then we've also reviewed the actions from the 2017 plan and identified those that have been completed or will be carried over into this plan but refined. We've also created new actions, and the data for the new actions has come from public input. So the public survey played a role, meetings, as well as the information provided in Social Pinpoint. We've also been working with the steering committee and the TAC and had interviews with departments to have further discussions about opportunities and needs. There was also a capability assessment that was performed, and the results from that have helped inform the mitigation strategy. And the capability assessment is looking at the resources available to the city and other agencies to implement these actions. The risk assessment, which Christina just provided an overview, helped inform the action plan, and then other plans were also reviewed. So once we develop the actions, they are prioritized, and I will go over that process later in this section. And the resulting product is a comprehensive action plan that will have the actions prioritized. So briefly, I will go over the 2022 Hazard Mitigation Plan goals, since they may be new to some on the call. The first goal is to utilize personal experiences and sciences to inform strategies and decision-making to increase resilience. The second identified goal is to develop tailored solutions that result in community members being equitably represented and protected from hazards. focusing on those that are most vulnerable to hazards and climate change. The third is to integrate hazard risk reduction activities into city practices, including policy development, procedural implementation, operations, and funding mechanisms. The fourth goal is to expand and enhance partnerships between government, businesses, the public, and community partners to foster more effective mitigation action and build community resilience. And the fifth is to promote public awareness of hazard risk and mitigation actions and sustain public engagement through community champions. So there are 7 broad action categorizations for the mitigation actions in this plan. The first is prevention, second is property protection, structural projects, natural resource protection, emergency services, public education awareness, and social cohesion. And the next several slides will go into a little more detail with examples on the types of projects. So prevention is administrative or regulatory actions that influence the way that land is developed and buildings are built. So examples can include planning and zoning, building codes, open space preservation, and floodplain regulations. The next, property protection, are typically actions that involve the modification of existing buildings to protect them from a hazard or remove them from a hazard area. Examples can include acquisitions, relocations, elevating a structural, retrofits. So an example of a retrofit, you may from time to time see air conditioners elevated and flooding in areas where it floods, and storm shutters are another example. Structural projects can include, structural projects are actions that are intended to lessen the impact of a hazard by modifying the natural progression of the hazard. So examples can include dams, levees, detention or retention basins, channel modifications, retaining walls, and storm sewers. Natural resource protection projects are actions that, in addition to minimizing the impact of a hazard, also preserve or restore the functions of natural systems. So examples include floodplain protection, habitat preservation, slope stabilization, riparian buffers, and forest management. Emergency services are actions that protect people and property during and immediately after an event. Examples can include warning systems, evacuation planning, emergency response training, and protection of critical emergency facilities or systems. Public education and awareness projects are actions to inform citizens about the hazards and the techniques that citizens can use to protect themselves and their property. So these examples include outreach projects, education projects, schools, library materials, and demonstration events. And last, social cohesion projects are actions that help residents build and maintain relationships with each other, especially neighbors, to create shared plans and develop shared resources to jointly prepare for, withstand, and recover from hazards. And examples include resilience hubs, block parties, storm drain cleanup, and free little libraries and pantries. So as I mentioned earlier, the city has developed a prioritization process for the mitigation actions, and there are 7 criteria that were included in the prioritization process. So feasibility, and it was given a weighting factor of 20%, and feasibility is focusing on whether funding is identified and the ease or complexity of implementation. Equity is the second criteria, and it is tied to the opportunity index And the categories with the opportunity index were used for the categorizations for the scoring criteria. Climate resilience considers the action's impact on the ability to bounce forward from an event. So the classifications here were very high, and whether it provides multiple events for climate resilience, including greenhouse gas or adaptive measures, and high was whether it provided one benefit, and then moderate, it provided limited benefits, and then low, it did not provide any. Next, we included public input into the prioritization. So we considered the project type. There was a question on the public survey regarding the types of projects that the public found important. So based on those results, we identified the scoring criteria, and you will see those on the slide. And then also the public identified their hazards of greatest concern. So we included those in the scoring criteria. And then last are two requirements from FEMA that we consider the risk reduction or benefits from the project, as well as costs. So those are the last two criteria on the slide. And then as we've been doing the prioritization, there are some actions that are bubbling up to the top. So and these aren't in any specific order. So updates to the emergency operations plan, including a cyber component to the plan, has been identified. There have been a number of actions tied to stormwater management improvements that include studies, structural projects, and possible improvements to policies and ordinances. Updates to the dam inundation mapping has been identified as a need and is one of the higher ranked actions. Communication and engaging with vulnerable populations in disaster, in mitigation and disaster preparedness and planning has been identified, and there are several actions related to that. Public education and outreach programs were identified. CRS planning, so doing additional CRS activities, which will also improve the score for the city, including climate change impacts and vulnerability assessments, and then resilience hubs and backup power for city-owned housing communities.
So this is a really important part in the presentation. We'd love some feedback from you all now that you have hopefully a greater understanding of what hazard mitigation is and the type of risk reduction actions. If there's any that are maybe ideas that you have, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to put those in the chat or come off mute and chat with us. Does anybody have different ideas for risk reduction within the city? Right. Well, we'll keep moving along then. We're about finished with the presentation, but we will stay a little bit after in case you'd rather chat with a smaller group. So in terms of next steps, so that this plan is still active, we're still in the process of writing it, but it's quickly coming to an end. So we will be able to release that draft to the public in July. So look for that next month. It'll get posted. And we'll post it to Social Pinpoint, but of course that'll be linked through the typical channels, the same channels that you received the notification for this meeting to register for it. You'll see it through those same channels to be able to review the plan, take a look at the whole thing. They're quite large, actually. They can be several hundred pages, mostly due to the risk assessment. There's a lot of really good information and sometimes quite technical information in there that's designed to help the city. But that action plan, again, is really important and something we want to make sure that the public agrees with and has input on. And then lastly, this will actually occur more likely in October rather than September. But once FEMA provides the final approval on the draft plan, the city will be able to adopt that, and they'll do that via a city council meeting. So that'll be the last step. And then the plan will be in good shape and up to date for 5 more years. So with that, that concludes our meeting. We'll stay on the line in case anybody has questions or comments that they'd like to relay to us. Thank you all so much for your time in coming, and I hope you have a great evening.